One of the examples that Berker talks about is appropriate or inappropriate. Where does that fit in? It's appropriate that A, or it's not appropriate, it's inappropriate that A. Are they deontic? Are they evaluative? Well, people might react either way, and they might disagree. Some might assign it to the deontic category, others might assign it to the evaluative category. But actually, if we start thinking it through, we realize it doesn't quite fit either one. Let's think about the guiding metaphor, first of all. When I think about something being appropriate, I think about it fitting the situation. Was that an appropriate way to behave? Well, does it fit the circumstance? And so it's something like fitting, like a puzzle piece fitting in. That's something that seems like the guiding metaphor here. Does it fit? If we then begin to ask about other tests, we also get puzzling results that don't fit the deontic or the evaluative. So, first of all, we can ask, are there duals? It's appropriate to A. Is that equivalent to it's not blank, not to A? Or it's inappropriate to A. Is that the same as it's not blank, not to A? Certainly, it's appropriate to A is not equivalent to it's not inappropriate, not to A. There's no obvious dual here. It looks like we do not have duals in this case. Well, that suggests that these belong to the evaluative category. Let's move on to the second test. What kind of opposite does appropriate have? Well, the answer is the opposite of appropriate is inappropriate, right? And that sounds like a privative opposite. It's dividing things into things that fit the situation and things that don't fit the situation. And so it looks as if there's this simple divide. To be appropriate is to not be inappropriate. To be inappropriate is not to be appropriate. And so these aren't polar opposites, opposite ends of an extreme. It looks as if they just divide the space. So we've got privative opposites, as if now these things were deontic categories. So already we have a clash. They exhibit the evaluative characteristic when we ask about duals, but as soon as we move to opposites, it looks as if now we're dealing with a deontic concept. What about gradability, our third test? Are there degrees of appropriateness or inappropriateness? If we think about appropriate, it's unclear and it's hard to see that there are really degrees of this. Does it fit the situation? Well, then it's appropriate. Can something be more appropriate or most appropriate? I've put question marks here. I'm not entirely sure. It seems to me questionable. If it's appropriate, it's appropriate. Now, something might be even better fitting in that situation. Maybe there are degrees of fit here. And we can say, well, that's close enough. I think there can be room for some disagreement here, so I'm not sure really whether the positive side of this is gradable. But the negative side does seem to be inappropriate. Can something be more inappropriate or most inappropriate? Yes, surely. Somebody who talks frequently in class without raising their hand, for example, other than the professor, seems to be behaving inappropriately. If that person begins throwing things around the room, in addition, that's even more inappropriate. And then if they direct violence against other students, that's even more inappropriate than that. That would be the most inappropriate of those three options. And so we have no problem thinking about degrees of inappropriateness. It's less clear whether there are degrees of appropriateness. So let's think of this as semi-gradable. Maybe it's fully gradable, but it's questionable with respect to the positive concept. The negative clearly is. There are degrees of that, but it's not so obvious whether there are degrees of the positive concept. And that makes sense in terms of our guiding metaphor. Does this puzzle piece fit? Well, if the answer is yes, it fits. There's nothing more to be said. If it doesn't fit, well, it might almost fit, or no, not quite, or oh, no, that's not the right shape at all. And so there can be degrees of not fitting, but it doesn't look like there are degrees of fitting. So let's add this up in a table. We think about the appropriate and inappropriate. It appears that the guiding metaphor is neither deontic nor evaluative. It's a third thing. It has to do with fitting, or maybe matching a situation or a circumstance or a problem. And then if we think about duals, the answer is no. There it agrees with the evaluative category. On the other hand, opposites, there it seems to agree with the Deontic category in that they're privative opposites, but then when we turn to gradability, it looks as if, well, we don't really have it matching either one. It falls somewhere in between. It's something like semi-gradable. The negative concepts clearly do have degrees, but the positive concepts, it's much less clear. Some of you might react by thinking they do, some might react by thinking they don't. There can be disagreement about that, so it's questionable. In any case, that suggests that we've got one case of a test coming out Deontic, one comes out evaluative, one comes out somewhere in between. And the guiding metaphor idea suggests that this is something else entirely. Now, there are many other concepts that have this sort of character. So think about the correct and the incorrect. The metaphor here seems clear. It's matching. So let's ask about duals. It's correct to A if and only if it's not blank, not to A. Well, we don't want to say it's correct to A if and only if it's not incorrect, not to A. That seems clearly wrong. And the same thing is true of incorrectness. Not true, for example, that it's incorrect to do this is just the same as saying it's not correct not to do this. Those seem like completely different things. So this has no dual. Let's look at opposites. Correct and incorrect, that seems to divide the space very clearly. So we've got privative opposites. And then if we ask about gradability, can something be more correct, most correct? I don't know. It can surely be more incorrect or most incorrect. If I say, what's the square root of 9, and you say 3, well, that's a pretty good answer. It's a better answer if you say plus or minus 3. And so, is that more correct? Well, here again, we're not sure what to say. It depends. Are we talking about the natural numbers or the integers here? Are negatives included in our domain of discourse? If they are, and I just answer 3, then I'm not quite getting it right. If, on the other hand, I say 3 or minus 3, and we're just talking about the natural numbers, minus 3 isn't a natural number, so maybe that's an inappropriate answer. In any case, it looks like, no, if getting the problem right is getting the problem right. On the other hand, if we think about incorrect answers, let's say we're talking about the integers, and we really want the answer 3 or minus 3, plus or minus 3. Well, then 3 is not correct, but it's close to being correct. If you answer 1, that's much more incorrect. If you answer London, that's really incorrect. You're not even in the right ballpark. And so it looks as if there are degrees of incorrectness, even though it's questionable whether there are degrees of correctness. So summarizing in a table, once again, we get a guiding metaphor of a match, which seems to make it like appropriate or inappropriate. Are there duals? No. In that respect, it's like an evaluative category. But the opposites are privative, as if it were a Deontic category. And then what about gradability? It's maybe semi-gradable. There are degrees for the negative concept, but not really, or at least questionably so, for the positive concept. Well, I won't go through it in detail, but the same thing is true for reasonable and unreasonable. There are no duals. It's reasonable for you to do something. That's not the same as it's not unreasonable for you not to do it. And so we don't really have a dual in this space. If we think about opposites, well, it looks as if to be unreasonable is just to be not reasonable. And so it looks as if we have privative opposites. They simply divide the space between the reasonable and the unreasonable. And then if we think about gradability, can something be more reasonable? Well, if the other thing is unreasonable, maybe. But if they're all reasonable, can you even be more reasonable? Maybe, again. You can surely be more unreasonable. And so it looks like, again, we have this semi-gradability, questionable with respect to the positive concept, but clear with respect to the negative concept. So it's very much like appropriate and inappropriate, or correct and incorrect. Berker introduces a third category to cover cases like appropriateness, or being reasonable or rational, or this idea of correctness and incorrectness. All of those concepts, he says, demand a third category. He calls it the aptic category. The idea is that it has to do with being apt, with fitting or matching a situation. And so the guiding metaphor is fitting or matching. Are there duals? No. What kind of opposites are there? Privative opposites. And finally, are they gradable? Well, in the positive case, questionable. but with the negative, yes. And so they are semi-gradable. Now, here is where I want to make a move beyond what Berker says explicitly. I think this applies to some of our most central moral concepts, and in particular to right and wrong, and just and unjust. Those are often thought to be classic Deontic categories, but I think they're not. They're Aptic categories. They fall into this third category. And so let's look at those concepts carefully. First of all, right and wrong. Let's apply our tests. What is the guiding metaphor for right and wrong? Now here I think it's hard to say. Is it something like a smiley face as if it were evaluative? Is it binding or constraining? Or is it something like fitting or matching? We might not be sure. And so I think that consideration is not decisive. But let's take a look at the other tests. Are there duals, first of all? It's right to A if and only if it's not blank not to A. I don't know how to fill in that blank. Or similarly, it's wrong to A if and only if it's not blank not to A. We certainly don't want to say it's wrong to do something if and only if it's not right not to do it. That doesn't seem right at all. And so there is no obvious dual for right and wrong here. What kind of opposite is there? Privative or polar? Well, we might think at first glance polar. Right and wrong seem like extreme ends. On the other hand, that's not obvious at all. Isn't it pretty much the same to say wrong means not right? Or that right means, well, it's not wrong? So there's strong reason for thinking that it's privative opposites, that we're dividing the space into two categories, right and wrong. Certainly that's clear if we're thinking about this outside a moral context, like right and wrong answer. Then it's just like correct and incorrect. And so it's natural, I think, for us to think, well, it's the same concept of right and wrong in arithmetic or in grammar as well as in morality. Either you are obeying the rules, in which case your action is right, or you're not obeying the rules, in which case your action is wrong. That would make them privative opposites. And then finally, think about gradability. Are there degrees of right and wrong? Well, if something is right, it seems odd to think of there being degrees. Can something be righter or rightest? More right? Most right? I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to me plausible, but on the other hand, I think it's a bit questionable. But if you say, what about wrong? Well, we certainly don't have words wronger and wrongest. On the other hand, we can talk about one action being wrong, another being even more wrong, and finally this one being the most wrong. So let's think about an example of doing something wrong. One student cheats on the test by looking at somebody else's paper. That's wrong. Another student has managed to get a copy of the exam beforehand and has distributed it to his friends. That seems somehow more wrong. What about somebody who has managed to get a copy of the test and distributed it to the entire class? That seems even more wrong than that. And so it looks plausible to say there are degrees of wrongness, even if we're not sure at all that there are degrees of rightness. Well, if we summarize this, we can say right and wrong, those seem like privative opposites. There's no dual. And we've got semi-gradability. Wrong seems gradable, but right, questionable. And so in all those respects, it looks like right and wrong are aptic categories. They are concepts that fall into that aptic classification. They are in some respects evaluative, in some respects deontic. The test results are mixed, but they match precisely appropriate and inappropriate, correct and incorrect, reasonable and unreasonable. Now let's move on to justice. Just and unjust. I think they fall into that aptic category as well. What's the guiding metaphor here? Well, maybe something like a set of scales, right? We often see a statue of justice as being blind and holding scales. Somehow getting the right balance, getting, well, the correct answer out of a problem, deciding what the right solution is. All of those seem like matters of justice. Getting the scales right, weighing things correctly. And that strongly suggests that this is going to fall into the same category as right and wrong, correct and incorrect. Are there duals? The answer appears to be no. It's just that A. It's not blank that not A. We certainly can't say unjust. It's just that A, so it's not unjust that not A. No, that's not the same thing at all. And same with unjust. It's unjust that A. Does it follow that it's not blank that not A? It's certainly not. It's not just that not A. It's more like, hey, if it's unjust, then it's not just. It's that A is not just, not A is not just. And so it looks as if in this case we don't have a dual. In fact, we have privative opposites. Unjust is just not just. They divide the space into the just and the unjust. They aren't extremes of something. They are instead a simple division. Either it's fair or it's not. It's just or it's not. Finally, what about degrees? Are there degrees of justice or injustice? Now here it looks as if, well, once again in the positive case we get questionable. This is just, that's even more just. That's the most just. Maybe we could say that, but I'm doubtful. Both Aristotle and Aspasius, who wrote the earliest surviving commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, deny that there are degrees of justice. After all, if it's the just verdict, well, it's the verdict that is correct that ought to come out in that situation. And so it looks as if there can't be degrees of that. If it's just, you can't get more just. It's already the right answer. On the other hand, are there degrees of injustice? Sure. Something can be unjust. Something can be even more unjust. Unjust to find the person guilty, but even more unjust to find them guilty and sentence them to a long prison sentence. And then finally, even more unjust than that, to find them guilty and then assign them the death penalty. So there can surely be degrees of injustice, even if we're not sure that there can be degrees of justice. So summarizing, it looks as if, well, our guiding metaphor here is scales, but that seems similar to the idea of fitting or matching something. And then we say, are there duals? No. What kind of opposites are there? Privative opposites. Are these concepts gradable? Well, in the positive case, probably not. But in the negative case, yes, so they're semi-gradable. In short, there's an agreement here with right and wrong, appropriate and inappropriate, reasonable and unreasonable. It falls into the same category, the aptic category. If we summarize these things then, it looks as if there are three basic categories of moral concepts and normative concepts generally, not just two. There are deontic concepts like should, ought, may, must, obligatory, permitted, forbidden. There are evaluative categories like good and bad, better and worse, best and worst. There are also aptic categories, things like appropriate and inappropriate, fitting and unfitting, proper and improper, correct and incorrect, reasonable and unreasonable, and, I maintain, right and wrong, just and unjust. Once we recognize that, we see that traditionally people have been thinking about the ethical, and more broadly the normative, in too confined a way. They've only gotten 2/3 of the space right. There is this third category, and it turns out to be a very important category. Right and wrong, just and unjust, all sorts of other concepts fall under that third category. We need to think in a more complicated way about ethical concepts than people have up to now.